In today's video, we're going to be testing AMD fluid motion frames into the most popular Steam games. And just before we start, I just want to clarify a few things. Yes, in the last video we did make one more mistake, even though after I made another video testing AMD Radeon. And that mistake was that third-party software that I was using wasn't actually measuring the extra frame rate you get with fluid motion frames. We're going to make sure that doesn't happen again in this video. And in addition to that, I'm actually using the 7800X 3D, which you can see in the background right there. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So you might notice right off the bat that we're not using my main PC, we're using the test bench SSD that I've installed in my main PC, along with the 7800X 3D and the main motherboard that I usually use to test GPUs. The first thing that we're going to do is install the brand new official driver release for fluid motion frames. We are running the 7800 XT this time as well, because again we are running the 7800 X 3D. So you want to head over to AMD drivers, download, AMD drivers and support, and we want to go to RX 7000 series, 7800 series, 7800 XT, submit, and then we'll download the Windows 11 version. Then we want to install that driver, click yes, and install. Then we want to hit don't allow AMD to collect information, next, skip. So while that's installing, I want to look at the blog post for the new driver release. So we are currently installing the AMD software 24.1.1, so this is the absolute latest software that's currently out, which officially has fluid motion frames. So unlike in the previous software, we shouldn't really have any bugs when it comes to using fluid motion frames in this software. You can see they show some FPS with the new RX 7600 XT, 16GB, and as you can see, using FSR2 on quality mode, plus HyperRX, plus fluid motion frames, you can see there's a massive increase in FPS here. So in this video, it would be pretty interesting to see how much of an impact fluid motion frames has on the most popular games right now on Steam. You can see there's some more benchmarks here with the new 8700G, which has a 780M GPU. So it's an RDNA 3 GPU inside of a CPU, so an APU. And you can see there's massive uplift in performance using fluid motion frames. In the software, they've also improved encoding performance, so they've got new video upscaling for video playback or watching videos on YouTube or some other website. And they've now updated the quality on HEVC, AVC, and AV1 encoding. As you can see, the drivers installing. And they've also updated some other stuff in this software. They've also added AMD Assistant, which just overall just tells the user where things are. As you know, there is a lot of features and different stuff in the new AMD software. And here's some endnotes that they put in the blog post as well. AMD Fluid Motion Frames, or AFMF, is a frame generation technology designed to increase frame rates and smooth movement for game-winning performance with minimal impact to image quality. It's designed to integrate into AMD software and currently supports the RX 6000 and 7000 series graphics cards. And as you can see, it says here that it works with multiple other technologies, as we know. And you can see here, AMD Fidelity FX Super Resolution versions 1, 2, and 3 are available on select games which require game developer integration. So it's important to highlight the difference between FSR and AFMF. AMFF is a driver integration, which means it's tacked on within the driver, so it won't be compatible cross-vendor. While FSR3 is an in-game integration. But FSR3 does use fluid motion frames, but an enhanced version of fluid motion frames. That much like standard AFMF, uses optical flow analysis, but this time it uses the game's inbuilt temporal data, such as motion vectors, to generate much higher quality frames versus standard AFMF. And how that differs to standard AFMF is that AFMF is generating frames based on 2D imagery that isn't temporal at all. So it's just taking a 2D image that's being printed on the screen, using optical flow analysis to interpret the next frame based on movement within that 2D information, and generating a frame based off that. So using standard fluid motion frames, you will get lower quality imagery coming out of it. That's an important thing to keep in mind. None of the games that we've tested today support FSR3. In the future, I will make more videos testing FSR3, but just keep that in mind. Which is why third-party software doesn't support it, because frames are being tacked on in the driver, rather than being tacked on within the actual game, using the standard 3D pipeline within those games. So you can pretty much think of it like flow frames. It uses optical flow analysis, so if you take a video and import it into this software uses optical flow analysis on the GPU to generate those new frames based on the information and the motion within the footage that's being provided using algorithms. But with fluid motion frames, those extra frames are being interpreted based on the previous frame and the last frame being generated, but only in 2D, without any temporal data from the game. That's why it's a driver addition. While FSR3 takes the temporal information in the game, such as motion vectors, to generate those frames, again based on the previous frame and the last frame generated by the game. It's just got that extra information. And how does that differ to frame generation, you might ask? Well, frame generation uses the power of the 4th generation tensor cores within the 40 series, that's why it's exclusive to the 40 series, to generate frames using advanced matrix computation within the tensor cores. But frame generation works similarly to FSR3, where it's a game integration. So it's not like the standard AFMF and AMD where it's a driver tack on. It's also, much like FSR3, a game integration because it also uses that temporal information to generate new frames. The difference between FSR3 and frame generation is that frame generation on the video uses AI algorithms and advanced matrix computation on the tensor cores to generate new frames. Again, on the previous frame and the last frame generated by the 3D render pipeline. So the performance hit that we got in the previous video, checking the FPS using third-party overlays, the reason why the FPS dropped is because of that asynchronous compute. We were seeing the real frames being generated by the 3D render pipeline. And that's really about it on the new driver that just got released, and also just to clarify a few things in the previous video and about FSR3 and AFMF. So now the installation is complete, so we can launch the AMD software Adrenaline Edition. We can hit skip this, and we can head over into the gaming tab, click the graphics tab, and enable HyperRX. And again, that's going to enable fluid motion frames within our games. And while we're here, we might as well configure all the overlay features because yes, we are going to use the AMD overlay, unlike last time. So we're going to hit the performance tab. So let's enable the overlay, and you can see there it is. And right now, this is the only way we can measure those extra frames. So now that we've enabled HyperX, let's jump into the first game that we're going to be testing today, and that's Palworld. You can see now we're in Palworld, and you can see in the top right hand corner, the overlay is now working, and we do in fact have fluid motion frames enabled. And it totally didn't take me, hours and hours to try and get this FPS overlay to work in this game, but whatever. Let's jump straight into the game and see how it performs. And you can see it running this game at 4K at the absolute highest settings. Of course, we aren't using DLSS or any upscaling of any kind, and we aren't using RSR today because I just want to see how does fluid motion frames perform on its own. And you can see we're getting around 100 FPS. So yeah, it's performing absolutely beautifully here. And let's try actually disabling fluid motion frames to see how much of an FPS difference it makes here. And you can see without fluid motion frames on, we're getting around 50 FPS, so it's about double the FPS of 4K. So in this game, the most popular game at the moment, it's running exceptionally well at 4K. And this is a 7800 XT, by the way. So let me just turn that back on for a second. So yeah, fluid motion frames in this game, literally the most popular game, is performing absolutely beautifully, 100 FPS. And this game, not gonna lie, kind of looks pretty beautiful at this resolution. And we got the FPS to back it up, so I would happily play this game at this resolution, thanks to fluid motion frames. But yeah, I didn't expect pretty much a double FPS increase of 4K, I'm not gonna lie. We might try it at different resolutions, but yeah. I would say it feels a lot smoother with fluid motion frames on. It does feel like in some places not that consistent because it is, again, frame generation. So there is added latency and stuff like that added to the game. But yeah, overall, it feels a lot smoother with fluid motion frames on. Might go ahead and actually capture this guy. I don't know if I can do that. Oh, he just... well, I just died. How about that? That was quick. Anyway, I'm actually going to go ahead and lower the resolution a bit to about 1440p and see how much of a difference that makes to our performance with fluid motion frames enabled. And you can see here at 1440p with fluid motion frames active, we're getting in the neighborhood of around 180 FPS, so it is a lot higher at 1440p, and it does feel a lot smoother with fluid motion frames. Let's actually turn off fluid motion frames for a little bit to just see how much of an impact fluid motion frames is having on our game here. So before 1440p, we were getting around 100 FPS, so we were getting the same FPS with fluid motion frames of 4K at 1440p without fluid motion frames. That's how good fluid motion frames is. And if we turn it back on for a second here, you can see we're getting like 200 FPS, so it's pretty much doubled, and it feels a lot smoother here as well. So yeah, overall I'm pretty impressed with fluid motion frames, not gonna lie. I should really go grab my stuff because I did in fact die. So yeah, overall, you're gonna get a much better experience on AMD because even though this does have DLSS on the video, it doesn't have frame generation, it's just super resolution. So all the time, you are gonna get a better experience on AMD because of fluid motion frames, which is a really, really good thing in this game. And again, we aren't using any super resolution, so this is just fluid motion frames because I want to see just with fluid motion frames how much of an impact it has. And overall, it's really, really, really good without super resolution. Might as well go ahead and capture some Pokemon, you know? Oh, I think we got him. There we go. God damn, look at this guy. King of the forest. I don't think we can take on that guy, not with our weaponry. This game does look really good as well because it is Unreal Engine 5. So yeah, that's about it for Palworld. Let's go ahead and take a look at some other popular games on Steam to see how fluid motion frames performs on the 7800 XT. So now we're in CS2, which is a bit more of a different game than Palworld, but still definitely popular in 2024 thanks to the Source 2 engine update. And we're gonna start things off by setting our resolution to 1080p at full screen with the lowest possible settings with FSR set to performance. Because I want to see the absolute highest FPS we can possibly go at reasonable competitive settings here with fluid motion frames. We're going to start things off with fluid motion frames off so I can gauge the performance without it. So we're going to head into maybe a Dust 2 and we'll see just how much more frames you can push using fluid motion frames in something as easy to run as CS2. And you can see even without fluid motion frames, we're still getting in the neighborhood around 600 FPS. And while the game does look pretty terrible using FSR, in my opinion, FSR in this game doesn't really have an impact on performance. It just makes the game look horrible in my opinion, but we'll turn it on nonetheless. So now let's go ahead and enable fluid motion frames. And you can see we're now getting 760 FPS at 1080p, FSR set to performance. So that's crazy. That's honestly crazy that we're getting that much FPS and it feels buttery smooth. No stutters whatsoever. And on 1% lows or on 99th percentiles, it's around 600. So that's insane for this game. What isn't insane is my skills, of course. In some areas, we're even getting like 780. So that's insane. That's absolutely insane. So definitely in this game, fluid motion frames is going to have an impact. Even a game that already gives you like 600 FPS. Fluid motion frames is still going to give you more FPS. Now obviously you wouldn't want fluid motion frames to be on in a game like this because it is a competitive title. It's unlike Palworld where, you know, it's an open world sort of, I don't know, survival game. This is more of a competitive title and the latency edge you get without having it on is going to be more worthwhile than having the extra frames you get. Because again, we were getting 600 FPS before. But with that said, it's still pretty cool to see how much more FPS we can get with fluid motion frames. Obviously, it's not going to double the FPS because we were getting a lot of FPS even beforehand, but it's still pretty cool to see. So yeah, that's it for CS2. I think we're not going to change the resolution or settings or anything. I just wanted to see at the lowest possible settings with 1080p, how much more FPS could we get with fluid motion frames? And you do get a good decent bit more FPS. So now we're in Dota 2, a bit more of a different game this time. And again, it isn't really a game that you would turn on fluid motion frames in, but I'm just curious to see how it performs. We're going to start things off by setting it at 4K, the absolute highest settings. And you can see without fluid motion frames, we're still getting in the neighborhood of around 210 FPS. So it performs absolutely beautiful at the highest settings already. But when I turn on fluid motion frames, you can see we're now getting around 400 FPS. So it's pretty much, maybe not double, but it's increased our FPS by a long shot, even in a game like this. You can see it's absolutely buttery smooth here at 4K. So yeah, the game looks absolutely beautiful at this resolution and we're still getting 400 FPS. So fluid motion frames is making a very big difference here, even though we were getting 200 FPS, and it does feel incredibly smooth. Now, I doubt changing the resolution or changing the game settings are gonna do much to our performance or smoothness in the game. We might as well try that. So maybe we'll drop down the resolution to 1440p, and maybe we'll just lower the settings to the absolute lowest we can go here. We'll keep on anti-aliasing because we are gonna keep fidelity effects on. We hit apply, and as you can see with fluid motion frames on, we're getting around 450, 440 FPS. So it hasn't made like a huge difference, and we have dropped the quality by a lot. Turning off fluid motion frames, we're gonna see that drop down to around 200, 217, 215. And we just died because I have no idea how to play this game. This is actually the first time that I'm playing it. Yeah, since this game is really easy to run, changing the resolution isn't really gonna do much. We might change it to 1080p though, just to see the highest FPS we can get here. Fidelity effects is still on, by the way. And now we're at 1080p, and without fluid motion frames on, we're getting in the neighborhood of around 220. It does look markedly worse at 1080p, I've got to say that. And our FPS really isn't that much higher than before at this resolution, but we'll enable fluid motion frames nonetheless. And we're still getting around 440, so it's not that different, which is to be expected. It's not surprising. So anyway, that's about it for Dota 2. This is again a competitive experience, so you probably again don't want to be using fluid motion frames, much like CS2. But it's just interesting to see how it performs with fluid motion frames, and it does perform exceptionally well, even at 4K. So now we've head into a bit more of a newer game this time, and we're gonna head into our video settings. I've got FSR 2.2 set to balanced. I'm not sure why there's FSR 1.0 in here. You'd obviously want to use the newer version. And we've got it on the high preset. So yeah, and as you can see, without fluid motion frames, we're getting around 170 FPS. And this is 1440p, as you can see. So decent overall performance even without fluid motion frames, which seems to be the running theme with this graphics card. It performs decently without any, fluid motion frames or frame generation to speak of. But if we go ahead and enable fluid motion frames now, you can see we're getting in the neighborhood of 300 FPS in this game. And if it looks like I have no idea what I'm doing, it's because I literally don't. I've just opened this game, I have no idea how to play it. But anyway, that's besides the point. It's performing absolutely beautiful. It's very smooth, looks incredible. Now let's go ahead and up the settings a bit. So maybe we could try 4K in this game, set it to 4K. And maybe this time we can set FSR onto quality. Or ultra quality actually. And this time maybe you can set the preset to the ultra preset, so we can set the highest settings here and see how fluid motion frames fares. And we'll just turn off fluid motion frames for a sec. And without fluid motion frames, we're still getting 60 FPS. So it still performs excellently without fluid motion frames at the highest settings at 4K. But once we enable fluid motion frames here, you can see we're getting an neighborhood of around 125. So fluid motion frames once again in another popular title here. This is a game that came out last year, but it's still popular. You can see it's performing like an absolute champ. Fluid motion frames is giving us a lot more FPS. And the game goes from being pretty smooth at 60 FPS to incredibly smooth, getting around 120 FPS. So that's excellent. We're roughly around doubling our FPS here. Sorry if the gameplay is a bit boring because again, I just booted up this game for the first time. So yeah, that's fluid motion frames tested in some of the most popular Steam games. And I gotta say, fluid motion frames works brilliantly. But the question is, do I recommend turning it on? Definitely. But do keep in mind it's only going to work in games at the moment that are DirectX 11 and DirectX 12. It just so happens that the most popular games on Steam, or some of the most popular games on Steam, are DirectX 11 and DirectX 12. It's also good finally giving the 7800 XT a fighting chance at performing using fluid motion frames. So I hope you appreciated that in this video. I also throw up some graphs on screen comparing the 7800 XT, 7700 XT, 7600 to the 4060, 4060 Ti, and 4070 in Forza Horizon 5 and Cyberpunk 2077. In Forza Horizon 5 especially, I gotta say Radeon kills, absolutely kills. Fluid motion frames helps the Radeon cards exceed the performance in a lot of cases versus frame generation on the video. In ray tracing, most of the time frame generation is going to exceed Radeon, but it gets darn near close to NVIDIA in Cyberpunk 2077 using ray tracing. And this means when it comes to value, fluid motion frames is going to be your best bet, as all three of the Radeon cards are going to be a much better value when using frame generation. So that makes fluid motion frames definitely worth it to turn it on, and I would highly recommend it. Obviously don't go around turning it on in some competitive titles like CS2, but for what it's worth, fluid motion frames can take games from going decently smooth to exceptionally smooth, so keep that in mind. But anyways guys, that's all for today. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Also make sure to check out me trying out Radeon in 2024. We'll have that video up on the screen right now.